I think Trudeau acted rather heavy-handed. I don't, Trudeau's lost a lot of popularity in the past year and a bit for a whole
Hmm.
host of reasons. I mean, he when it comes to economics, he's just not that smart. He doesn't
Yeah.
quite get things. Here in Canada, we have, for example, we have a housing crisis. Now, if you look at what causes that, our fertility rate is like 1.43, so we're not making enough babies to sustain the population.
Hmm.
All of that is through immigration, and immigration is a result of policy. And Canada has brought in a lot of immigrants, and I'm actually quite supportive of that. At this point, though, Canada is full. I mean, it sounds strange to say that in such broad terms, but our national vacancy rate is pushing 1%. And in many communities, it's under that.
Whoa.
So there is an acute housing crisis right now, and its supply side is the issue, or demand. There's a supply demand imbalance. So the country right now is full. That's part of what's driving up real estate prices in excess of the rate of inflation. Is just because there is that supply demand imbalance. Because in reality, there is nothing forcing a buyer to put in a bid above asking price. They do that of their own free will.
Hmm.
There's no one out there saying, you've got to bid 50,000, 100,000 over asking. And yet people do that. So either they have, either there's too much money in the system, or they have the means to pay more, or whatever it might be. But we are still, even in today's environment, seeing property selling over asking price. Not like it was during the pandemic, but it's still happening.
Now, but what's driving this supply issue? I was in Canada, pre-COVID. I noticed there was still some land. There was, some
Yeah.
out there. So what is driving it? What are the factors here?
So the biggest issue right now is that it's very difficult to get projects approved in Canada. In most major cities, the process is highly bureaucratic. It's very slow.
Hmm.
There's a lot of hoops that you need to jump through. And I develop, I'm a real estate developer. I develop both in Canada and the US, and the differences are striking. We do probably 90% of our work in the US. That's not an accident. It's much easier. And of course, things vary by community. I would not develop in San Francisco, for example. I wouldn't
Hmm.
develop in New York, where, and I'm not just making this red versus blue or anything like that. It's really, some communities have a tremendous amount of bureaucracy and others don't. For example, we're developing right now in Colorado Springs, and I expect that process, so far, the process is going quite smoothly, and we're meeting our timelines. Other communities, not so much. So it's community by community. But in Canada, if I was to generalize, a lot of communities here have you jump through a lot of hoops. As a case in point, we have a 107 unit apartment building that has taken us 2 years to get entitled. And that's not a horror story by Canadian standards, but it's long because the expectation was it would be done in under a year. So, you never know.
But under a year was still sort of a base case expectation. It sounds
Correct.
like a
Yeah.
lengthy process. Yeah. What's the? I mean, is it just endless permits and questions back and forth? What actually makes it go slow?
A couple of things. Number one, there's just a lot of deliverables. So, for example,
Mm.
to go through zoning and get a site plan approval for, let's say, an apartment building, you have all of these studies. You've got a traffic study and a noise study and a wind study and all of these, of course, environmental, all of these different things. And by the time you've got through all of those, you've designed 90% of your building, because you're not going to get the answers to those questions unless you've designed the building to that degree, which means you're putting out a tremendous amount of cash. You're doing a ton of design work, and you don't even know if your project's approved yet. So, you're having to take a tremendous amount of upfront financial risk just for the chance to build something.
A wind study, you
A
said?
wind study, yes, absolutely.
And
Yeah.
you had to study how the wind's going to be affected by your
Well, yeah, and it kind of makes sense. I mean, if you think
project.
about a dense urban environment, you can get a bit
Yeah.
of a canyon effect happening if based on what's around you. So, are your buildings too tall, too tight together? What's the prevailing wind direction? Maybe you need to open things up to the sky a little bit, terrace things and things like that, so that you don't create that wind tunnel effect. So they want to see that. Yeah.
Wow. I hadn't considered that one. So presumably there are wind expert firms out there, huh?
There are. There are.
See,
Yeah.
creating jobs already.
Yeah.
Oh, that's interesting. So is it always been that way? Or I'm just wondering. So here's my sense from down here
Mhm.
is that watching Trudeau and Chrystia Freeland, I was really horrified by their what I consider to be very authoritarian sort of tendencies. That's how it looked from down here. I mean, obviously, the freezing of bank accounts was way over any sort of legal line that I could understand. In fact, I even changed my banks. I'm using the U.S. branch of TD Bank, but after they did what they did to Canadians, I said I can't not banking with you. That's all done. Is it gotten worse under because it's or has it just sort of been this way for a long time and just sort of doing what bureaucracies do, which
I
is
think
more of
those
what they do?
are exceptional cases. I mean, certainly if you go to Europe, you hear about governments reaching into people's bank accounts all day long. So I don't think we're anywhere near as bad as it might be in France or Italy or some other European countries.
Hmm.
But and I think it's a rare occurrence. But I'm not comfortable with it. That's for sure.
Hmm. Yeah. Well, as we were talking right before I hit the record button, I'm starting to see more and more and more videos of ordinary Canadians. I'll call them middle class, even slightly above middle class people who are self-professing 40, 50, $60,000 salaries who are crying because they can't make it. Like it's just, it's become really difficult. So I do know that Canada has one of the highest household indebtedness ratios out there. It has what appear to me to be exceptionally high real estate prices. Um, and so, given the resetting of mortgages that has clearly happened, I imagine that's locked even more people out of the game. Um,
Yeah, I think that's true. I mean, part of it is also expectation. So, for example, if you look at cities like Toronto, Toronto's very expensive.
mhm.
For $500,000, you're not buying a house, you're buying a condo. You're buying a box in the sky. If you want a freestanding home or a townhouse, you're in the million plus range. So you need a
Wow.
substantial income, even certainly a household income, in order to afford that. Or you need to have been on the ladder of real estate ownership for long enough that your equity has grown and you're able to play the game at this level. But it's certainly freezing a lot of people out of the market. I mean, really, what you're getting to is inflation, right?
Hmm.
And I kind of view inflation like the weather. You can say, well, some people attach a narrative to the weather. It's good weather or it's bad weather. But do you think Mother Nature cares what you think? Of course not.
Not much.
So there is no good weather or bad weather. There's just weather. That's it. So it is what it is. And inflation's kind of in that category. You can call it good or you can call it bad, but it is. So the question is, given that it is there a way that you can organize your personal affairs so that you come out on the winning side of that equation? Just like the weather, there's no good weather, bad weather. There's inappropriate clothing for the weather, but that's about it.
Hmm.
So it's kind of the same thing. So when I think about inflation, it's really debasement of the currency. What we're talking about is three effects. Purchasing power for people on fixed income gets wiped out,
Hmm.
savings get wiped out, but
Hmm.
also debt gets wiped out. So if you know that, then how would you organize your affairs a little bit differently to coming out on the winning side of that equation? Because inflation is a wealth transfer, it is a theft of sorts. It's a very clandestine theft. But it's, imagine if you went to the poker table or the blackjack tables in Vegas, and the dealer's dealing, but there's one player at the table that's got a magic set of cards in his lap and he can print cards at will. I
Hmm.
mean, they take you aback and break your knees. And yet that's the system that we are all living under. So
Yeah.
if you know that that exists, how would you play the game? Would you play the game differently? I think for me, the answer is yes. But I think a lot of people aren't trained to think that way, aren't programmed to think that way, or maybe even never thought to think that way. But I'll give you a very simple example. So imagine for a moment that you bought, and I'll keep the math simple. Imagine you bought a house for $1 million to keep the math simple. And let's imagine for a moment that inflation is running at 10%. It was kind of like that about a year ago. So not a stretch to do that mental thought exercise. And let's say that you purchased that price or that property, you financed 80% of it, you put down 20%, so you put down 200,000 in equity, you borrowed 800,000 from the bank. A year later, that house is priced, it's not worth 1.1 million, it's priced at 1.1 million because of the debasement of the currency. Let's say that in that first year you made no principal pay down, which is again not a bad
Simple
assumption.
math.
Simple math, right? So what's happened is your equity has gone from 200,000 to 300,000 in a year, and all you've done is sleep. Now that's leverage that has worked in your favor. Now the purists will say, okay, Victor, you didn't really earn 50% on your money because that money's worth less, and that's true. So in last year's dollars, that 300,000 is really worth 270 in last year's dollars. So you only made 35% rate of return on your equity, not 50. But you actually came out on the winning side of that equation. Most people don't think that way. And if you know that inflation is going to result over the longer term, not necessarily week by week or minute by minute, but over the longer term, is going to do that for you, then how would you organize your affairs to be on the winning side of that wealth transfer?
Well,
That's
and the
that's
tricky
the name
part,
of the game.
it is, and I guess we have to go with historicals here. The tricky part, of course, is picking an asset class that can match or hopefully exceed inflation, right? So Venezuela, you should look it out. Their stock market over the past couple of years went up 600,000%. Winning trade. Oops, inflation went up 2,000,000%.
Right.
So not a winning trade, right? So how do you feel real estate stacks up in that longer term dynamic?
Well, I think one of the advantages that real estate has the advantage of leverage working for you. So it's not just the asset itself, it's the asset combined with leverage because the devaluation is being applied to the debt more, and that's what's giving you the win, is the fact that the debt's being devalued. So if you're borrowing over a long enough time period, that you're paying that debt in future dollars that are worth less. So it's really the creditor, the debt holder, the holder of that loan, that is actually coming out on the losing side of that equation.
As we saw with the recent bank failures, right? Because
Absolutely.
yeah, they had a whole portfolio full of things that were yielding 1.5%, and then rates went to 4 and 5%, and so those, especially the long duration stuff, just got crushed on a capital basis. Just
absolutely, and the same thing with residential mortgages and or even commercial mortgages. I mean, we talk about this effect with the treasuries being held on banks' balance sheets. Yeah, held to maturity, you can hold them at book value and all the rest. But let's face it, we've had a decade or more of interest rates that are pretty close to the zero bound. So it's not just a few medium-sized banks. It is every single bank in the nation has this issue. Every single one. Because every single piece of paper that they're holding on their balance sheet was written at a very low interest rate. And so if you were to actually hold them on the balance sheet at market value, everyone's taken a massive haircut.